Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this wonderful talk that we're going to hear in a minute from Stephen Venables. By way of quick introduction, there's people joining us from all walks of life. There's many of Nacio Trust followers. There's people from Stephen's networks and also clients of Expert Wealth Management. One quick piece of housekeeping. This is an open meeting, so it is possible to talk during it, but we'd rather if everyone kept their videos off and their microphones muted. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so if you just put those in the chat, it'll be fantastic, and we'll come to all those questions. So just by way of quick background, a little bit about Nasio Trust before we get started with the main speaker. Nasio Trust was formed about 20 years ago. Nancy and I, myself, we started a project where we would like to try and look after children in Western Kenya here who mainly were orphaned through the HIV epidemic. And over the years, over 20 years now, that's grown from one thing to another. And we now look after nearly 500 children, providing them with education, feeding, and medical care. But since then, Nasio Trust has really become much more than that. It's fairly recently is working in the wider community where they're helping farmers understand better ways to farm the land. And this is all part of our program to try and ensure that that people in need are not actually just relying on handouts all the time, but they're basically understanding and learning how to be self-sufficient for themselves. In addition, Nancy and her team were the first to respond to massive floods we had in the area only last year. And likewise, they were at the central point of actually helping people understand the true impact of COVID and the things that they had to do in the area as well. So Nasio Trust has become much more than actually just the children that we also still support along the way. We do many fundraising, including one thing which is linking back to where we're talking about today, which is climbing Kilimanjaro and Mount Meru for charity. We'll mention a little bit about this later on. So if you are inspired by today's talk and you do want to think about joining Kilimanjaro, then absolutely you can come and join Nasio Trust and help a wonderful cause. So to our speaker today. Stephen Venables is probably best known for being the first Briton to climb or to summit Mount Everest without supplementary oxygen. And I joke aside that I've summited Kilimanjaro without supplementary oxygen and know how hard that was. So I can't imagine for 1 minute how hard it would be to do that on a peak that's over 8,000 meters. So Stephen certainly, but what many people don't know about Stephen is he's climbed throughout the world, including Africa, which he's going to talk about today. He's certainly had to overcome his challenges in his life. During one descent, the anchor that Stephen was abseiling down or coming down the rock from gave way on him, and he fell and he broke both legs fairly high up on the mountain, and he had to rely on his fellow climbers and rescue teams to get him down safely. Probably one of the largest challenges Stephen and his wife Rosie have had to face is the loss of their 12-year-old son to cancer. One can only imagine how tough that must have been for them, but they've both come through strong the other side. So today, Stephen's going to talk about climbing the highest peaks in Africa, something that's close to my heart, having climbed Kilimanjaro a few times before, but I'm dying and really interested to hear about the other peaks, such as Mountains of the Moon in Uganda. So that's enough from me. I'll pass you over to Stephen. Very welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this was a fantastic trip and a chance for me to make my first ever visit to Africa to attempt the 3 highest peaks on the continent, which, as I'm sure you know, are for some reason we're not moving the slides on here, so I just have to.
Oh, there we are.
Oh, there we are. Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Mount Kenya in Kenya, and the highest point of the Mountains of the Moon on the borders of Uganda and the Congo. Well, this was all thanks to a man called Anthony Willoughby, but this picture I took quite more recently, and this is actually from Parini Camp at Selenge Wildlife Reserve, which is actually run by my brother-in-law and his Maasai colleagues near Amboseli. And this is just this sort of transcendental early morning view from Kenya into Tanganyika to this extraordinary great extinct volcano Kilimanjaro, just sort of floating above the mists. And when I went to Kilimanjaro at the end of 1986, it was to the far side of the mountain, to the western side of the mountain. And it was thanks to this man, Anthony Willoughby, who travels everywhere in a pinstripe suit and a bowler hat, which was quite quickly purloined by the head porter, whose name I'm afraid I've forgotten. But he took a great shine to Willoughby's bowler hat and wore it through the duration of the Kilimanjaro climb. Well, like most weak, feeble Europeans, we depend on so many of these trips for strong local people to actually help get all the luggage up there, and a group of local porters are employed to help us make our way up the mountain. I was involved. I was sort of dragged in very much at the last minute as a sort of mountain expert to come and be general dog's body and come guide to the expedition, to help a group of people who really had very little mountaineering experience at all, arriving fresh from London, Tokyo and Hong Kong, all assembled by Willoughby to attempt these three African peaks. Well, we set off through the magnificent forest up the west side of the mountain. It was just glorious country, and amazing to think 2 days earlier I'd been walking the streets of North London. It's an African fire lily growing up amongst the undergrowth. Quite quickly the rain arrived that day, and everyone looked slightly less perky as we made our way through the dripping forest to our first camp. But by the second day, spirits really raised just by getting high on a ridge just covered in this extraordinary high altitude vegetation of heather trees, of giant groundsels and undergrowth, all manner of flowers like these lovely gladioli. Well, we got to our second camp where it was deemed we would have an acclimatization day. We're now at around about 4,000 meters above sea level, having left sea level only 3 days earlier. So we had a rest day in the mists, and here we are cooking up homemade donuts, accompanied I think by rum and a bottle of wine, and a huge great block of cheese there beside Trace's right knee. Well, we had a great rest day. It was good just to spend some time getting used to the altitude, and then the next day awoke to just the most glorious sunrise, and there above us was the great western wall, the breach wall of Kilimanjaro, this immense extinct volcano. A number of the party were going to go around the right hand side and round the mountain to join one of the more normal routes, the slightly easier routes up the mountain. A smaller group of us were going to head up to what's called the Western Breach and head up the Arrow Glacier. So that day, which I think was Christmas Day, we headed off to make our way to the ramshackle remains of a little hut beside the Arrow Glacier. Now, the chap in sort of trainers and bare legs is Andrew Villahovsky, who's lived many years in East Africa. He was actually in charge of this first part of the trip, a real expert on the East African mountains, who's made many first ascents in the area. And I was there very much as his sort of assistant guide. We were treated to a glorious evening. That's Anthony Willoughby, his wife Victoria, and sister-in-law Alexandra at the site of our bivouac. We're now around about 5,000 meters above sea level, really starting to feel the thinness of the air. And I have to say the next day, heading up that white slope and the rocks above, I found absolute purgatory. I was weak as a kitten. I really thought I wasn't going to make it up onto the summit plateau. I was completely finished when we arrived on the summit crater of Kilimanjaro to camp beside the Furtwängler Glacier. Then endured, I was in the green tent. We had about 4 of us crammed into each tent. I was in the green tent. I think it's probably the worst night I've ever spent on a mountain. Worse than bivouacking alone at 8,600 meters on Everest a couple of years later. I just felt like death. And the following morning, what was particularly galling was I just could barely put my boots on. And there were Victoria and Alexandra, the 2 sisters, skipping around in the snow, bright and breezy, completely unaffected by the altitude, loving every minute of it. Well, we staggered our way up the remaining few hundred feet to the summit of Kilimanjaro. Meanwhile, the rest of the team had gone round to the other side of the mountain, and the idea was that we would all meet on the summit, which more or less worked out. A couple of years later, I went back to Kilimanjaro, and I did come up that other side of the mountain, up the more usual route. And this was a picture I took at sunrise, coming up the interminable zigzags up these old cinder slopes that lead up onto the final crater rim. And our group, this was in 1989, approaching the summit of Kilimanjaro. Back in '86, we met the rest of our team, and my abiding memory of the final plods to the summit is one member of the team being gently prodded along by one of the porter guides, I think Aloysius, just murmuring to her gently, "Vomity, vomity, no problem," as we staggered our way up to the summit. Well, we made it. This picture was actually taken in 1989 of my group on the summit of Kilimanjaro. It's over 5,000 meters above sea level. It's getting on for 6,000 meters above sea level. It is a very high peak, and I certainly found going in 1 week from sea level was almost more than I could manage. Well, after our baptism by high altitude suffering, we deserved some R&R, and back in Kenya we had a lovely day's rest at this lovely hotel between Nairobi and Mount Kenya. And we were now joined by some more members of the team, including over on the right Didier and Isabelle and their father Maurice, who was I think in his 70s, who joined us from Lyon. And then with the help of Mark Savage, the local guide who now took over, we made our way towards Mount Kenya in his trusty Land Rover. And everyone here is looking rather sort of freshly laundered clothes, enjoying the sunshine. It was a wonderful change from the suffering on the summit of Kilimanjaro. You might notice we had these special 3 African Peaks t-shirts produced by Willoughby, and the slogan on the back, to which we all had to subscribe, was "I will not complain. Whatever happens, we'll just get on with it cheerfully." And often there are things to complain about. This picture was actually taken 2 years later when I came here with my wife Rosie, and this was the road from Chigoria during the wet season in 1989, when we'd actually stopped to put chains on the Land Rover to try and get through the mud. Christmas time, when we were there at the end of '86, was quite a dry season. We had pretty good weather on Mount Kenya, and it was lovely to approach the mountain from the east up the gorgeous valley from Chigoria. It is the most spectacular country, and like Kili, studded with these extraordinary plants, these giant groundsels and giant lobelia plants, for which the mountain is so famous. These curious plants, they're called lobelias, which look slightly different from the lobelias you might have in your garden in Britain. But they are related, and they're designed very specifically to cope with the rigors of the high altitude climate, including frequent snowfall. And demonstrated there by the fair hands of my wife, you can just see, if you part these protecting furry fronds, there are the little lobelia flowers. Apart from snow, one of the threats to the plants are these little fellows, the hyraxes, the rock hyraxes, which feed on the lobelia plants. There is also a tree hyrax, and both animals are related apparently to the elephant. It's hard to imagine, but that's their closest relation in the animal kingdom. When we were in Uganda, I think a tree hyrax actually went into the pot of the porter's dinner one night. I'm glad to say we didn't actually eat any of these hyraxes, but we did feast splendidly on New Year's Eve beside the Mintos Lake on the east side of Mount Kenya, and here we are preparing a large celebratory dinner. One of the things we were told not to complain about was if there should be some extra money spent on hiring extra staff, organised by Willoughby to carry up the wine, which he deemed essential to a successful mountain expedition. I have to say, I thought it was very civilised that wine was carried to all the high camps on the mountain. Doesn't necessarily improve your acclimatization, but it's great for morale. Well, this was the camp where we celebrated New Year's Eve beside the Mintos Lakes on the east side of Mount Kenya, and above us is the central granitic plug of this immense extinct volcano rising above the Athi Plain. The name was given to the mountain by the first Oxford professor of geography, Sir Halford Mackinder, and he came here in 1899. He had 5 months professor's summer holiday from university, and he wanted to make the first ascent of this splendid mountain. And he travelled from Britain via the Suez Canal. He took the new train from the coast up to Nairobi. And in Nairobi he hired 170 porters to carry all the luggage for himself and his companions, 2 guides from Courmayeur in the Alps, César Ollier and Joseph Brocherel. And they made their way up, taking many weeks, often hacking their way through the bamboo forests, eventually getting to the mountain. And seeing the twin peaks of the highest point, he decided to name them after two well-known Maasai chieftain. And the highest point he named Batian, and the next one he named Nelian. And sorry for that slight hesitation. I couldn't see the top of my screen, but those names have appeared. There is also a subsidiary, rather easier summit which you can walk up called Lenana, which is also, I think, just over 5,000 meters above sea level. Anyway, once again, we were going to split. Some of the party were going to go up Lenana, and the ones who felt up to it were going to attempt Nelian and maybe Batian, which involves some actually quite serious rock climbing. So, New Year's Day, we headed up over that gap on the skyline there to what's called the Austrian Hut, where we spent the final night. And that evening, here's a pensive Willoughby staring up at the summit tower of Nelian. Batian was first climbed in 1899 by Mackinder. Nelian, the slightly lower summit, was first climbed 30 years later, the first time anyone set foot on the mountain again, 1929, by a young coffee planter called Eric Shipton, who was to become one of the most famous mountain explorers of the 20th century, and a local district commissioner. This is back in the days of Britain running East Africa. Local high commissioner called Percy Wynne Harris, and they made the first ascent of Nelian, the slightly lower of the two summits, before continuing over the Gate of the Mists to Batian. Well, the route they climbed involved some quite serious rock climbing up this initial face, over a ridge, round the back, and then up the final summit tower. And the Shipton route was what we were going to take the next morning. It did involve some great rock climbing. I was enjoying myself enormously. I'm not sure that Willoughby here was necessarily enjoying the process. And as you can see, he's got quite a heavy rucksack on, because our plan was to spend the night on the summit. Anyway, here's Willoughby coming up one of the crux pitches of the climb, followed by his wife Victoria, looking slightly ambivalent about the pleasures of rock climbing. I think this was possibly her first rock climb ever, and she's doing it at nearly 5,000 meters above sea level. Anyway, we all made it up the final wall with fantastic views opening out over these immense plains with bits of jagged remains of the rim of the old volcano spread around us, and finally made it to the summit of Nelion late that afternoon. Here we are on the summit, and the person I should really mention is third from the right is Mark Savage, local expert, organizer of the Kenya section of the trip, and very much the head guide for this rock climb. Well, a former neighbour of mine in Bradford-on-Avon, who used to live in Kenya, he loved climbing Mount Kenya. He climbed many new routes up the mountain, and he liked watching the sunset, but that meant he was sort of stuck up there for the night. So eventually he decided over a period of weeks to carry up, I think in 8 journeys altogether, prefabricated sections of a little hut which he built himself in his garden in Nairobi, carried it all up the mountain, assembled it on the summit, and this bivouac hut remains to this day. So you can just see someone's leg poking out of this little hut with the open door there. So the plan was we would spend the night, all 8 of us I think, or 7 or 8, crammed into this little tin box for another extremely unpleasant high altitude night out on a mountain, and maybe continue the next morning across the Gate of the Mists to Batian. Well, alas, in the morning everything was covered in ice and frost and freezing rime, and I was very keen to go across to Batian. Mark Savage, the local expert, said no, look, these people don't have that much experience. I think we should just concentrate on getting back down again. So alas, we didn't go to the highest of the summit chieftains, but we did climb Nelion, and we then set off back down a series of abseiles and down climbing back down the mountain. The next day made our way round the south side of the mountain, lovely to see the other side of the mountain, and to see the famous Diamond Couloir, which I believe no longer exists, this ice ribbon descending from the Gate of the Mists. In fact, the Diamond Glacier, that white patch from which immense icicles are falling up near the gap there, that was crossed by Mackinder and his alpine guides back in 1899, cutting steps in what they described as iron-hard ice to make their way to the summit of Batian. Onward down a route known as the Old Moses Trail. I'm not quite sure why it's called the Old Moses, but it's a fantastic route, and I'm quite sure that without Mark Savage we never would have found our way down through the bamboo jungle and eventually back to the rendezvous with the rest of the team and the Land Rovers to take us back to Nairobi. Well, a couple of days later we were making our way across Uganda. This was New Year 1987. Only recently the murderous years of Amin's and Obote's rule had come to an end. Museveni had taken over in Uganda. Peace of a kind had been restored, but certainly the country had taken a real knocking, and very few tourists had been to the country for many years. So we were quite a curiosity, and all the way across Uganda we were the subject of immense curiosity. Up to when we arrived at the roadhead of the village where we were going to start our trek into the Ruwenzori Mountains. And these are some of the people of the local Bakonjo tribe. They're just fascinated to see all these weird people who've turned up from Tokyo and Hong Kong and Lyon and London to come and climb their mountains. Well, it seemed that everyone working in this village was related to a man called John Matt, and negotiations were done with John Matt and agreements on a number of men who would help us carry all our clobber up and show us the way on a very convoluted route up into the mountains. It was very hard to buy anything much in the shops in Uganda at that time, but you could get wonderful fresh fruit and veg, and here we are enjoying a final lovely picnic lunch before setting off on the first afternoon's walk up into the Ruwenzori Mountains. Ruwenzori means rainmaker. The mountains sit on the borders of Uganda and the Congo. Wet air currents waft up from the Congo virtually every day and deposit immense amounts of moisture on these mountains. So they're just clothed in extraordinary vegetation right up almost to the summits. And it rains a lot. We were there in the dry season in early January, but which meant that quite often it didn't rain in the mornings, but it certainly rained in the afternoons. The mountains are like an immense sponge, just soaking up limitless amounts of water. And this was on the second day of the walk-in, crossing Bigo Bog, magnificent country, hopping from tussock to tussock and occasionally falling in the morass in between the tussocks. I just loved it. I thought it was the most magical, extraordinary landscape I'd ever visited, and it was one of the great days in the mountains I've ever had. But it was very, very wet. And I felt the answer to this was you wear your wet clothes during the day, and you always have a set of dry clothes which you keep firmly sealed in a large polythene bag, and you only take out those dry clothes at night once you're safely under shelter. Well, that evening we stopped at one of the little mountain huts. Some of us slept in the hut, some of us camped, and I do remember as we changed into dry clothes and got a fire going, we cooked up a fantastic, great vat of mulled wine to celebrate our arrival at the far end of Bigo Bog, before continuing the next day upward into this extraordinary mountain landscape. The name Mountains of the Moon came from the Egyptian geographer Ptolemy back in the 2nd century, and he postulated that in the heart of Africa there were mountains, weird and wonderful mountains, which he called the Mountains of the Moon. And he described these mountains as the source, that they were covered in everlasting snow, which is one of the sources of the waters of the River Nile. And he was more or less spot on. The mountains were the first European to see these mountains was not Mount Stanley, but they eventually that was attributed to Stanley, hence the name Mount Stanley for the highest peak in the range. Well, we continued up to the Bujuku Lake, and then from there up the infamous Groundsel Gully, which was this sort of nightmare of slithery, muddy rocks coated with a thin layer of soggy lichen and newly falling snow. And you might just be able to make out two of our amazing Bakonjo men carrying all our stuff up this gully, amazingly in bare feet, which is why they were very keen to get to the highest huts, leave us there, and then scarper back down to lower altitudes where they could get warm again. Well, they deposited us at the Elena hut. Outside this little tin hut, you might be able to notice a pair of skis, a rather ancient pair of skis. They probably belonged to my friend Henry Osmaston, who's no longer alive, but I knew him back then in the 80s. And back in the 50s, he had been working in the forestry service here in Uganda, and he'd been one of the founder members of the Ski Club of Uganda, and the co-author of the beautifully written and beautifully researched climbing guide to the Ruwenzori Mountains, which was what was going to help us find our way to the summit of Mount Stanley. We had a day of sort of low cloud, snow and drizzle, where we just sort of hung out at the huts and the tents. I do remember that afternoon, Willoughby, bless him, we were in this tiny little hut. I think we had about 8 or 9 of us crammed into that hut. Willoughby came over from his more comfortable tent with a large bowl of hot soup and a fresh pineapple marinated in brandy. It was a wonderful picnic lunch. The following day, the weather wasn't much better, but we were due to return. Our time was up, so we just had to see if we could go for it. And we had a sort of chaotic pre-dawn departure, with me in the dark, losing my temper, trying to teach people to put on crampons who'd never put crampons on before we set off for the Elena Glacier, which you can just see appearing in the top of the picture there. The weather was extremely murky. Most of the time we're in a whiteout. And we got to a point where I said, well, I really can't promise that I know where we are. I had no local expert with me at this stage. I was in charge of this group of mountaineering novices. We got out Henry's guidebook, we got out the compass, we puzzled, and we tried to work out where we thought we might be. And everyone insisted we must carry on. So, well, I said, well, we'll try. Let's see what happens. Well, a friend of mine was here the previous year in 1986 when he took this picture, and he actually saw the summit of the Ruwenzori Mountains. On the left is Alexandra, named after the Queen of England and Empress of India back in the early 20th century, named by a relation of hers called the Duke of Abruzzi, a very famous Italian aristocratic explorer who came here with also with Courmayeur guides, employing hundreds of local Bakonjo people in 1906. And it was his team that made the first ascent of these and many other peaks in the area, Alexandra. And the highest point, which he named after his aunt, the Queen Mother of Italy, Margherita, in those days of imperialism. Well, this is where we were heading. We were heading across the Stanley Plateau in a whiteout, trying to find Margherita. I think we were supposed to be going to the sort of lower part of that ridge on the right. I think where we actually went, I think we weaved our way somewhere up there, because I do remember emerging on the summit ridge and then almost immediately arriving on what appeared to be the summit of Margherita. And the final section was quite exciting, weaving in and out of immense great holes and past these extraordinary sort of great protuberances of frozen rime, where all the moisture coming up from the Congo is just frozen on the summits of the mountains of the moon. We arrived on the summit. I did a quick check round and ascertained that precipices were dropping off in every direction, particularly in the west down to the Congo, and therefore we must be on the summit of Margherita, the highest point of the mountains of the moon. A summit picture before heading our way rapidly back down to the Elena huts. Didier and Maurice and Isabelle, Maurice was in his 70s and moving very slowly. They'd actually gone up separately, and I was quite worried because they didn't come down for about another hour or two, and I ended up waiting with Willoughby, and eventually two little figures appeared coming back from the summit, and we could head down towards the Kitandara Lakes, nestling down in the forest there. And late that night we got back down to the Kitandara Lakes. Well, again, I think it's the most enchanted landscape, and I'll always remember our final night camping at the Byonjogola cave, where Abruzzi had had his base camp back in 1906. Camping there that night, the smell of fires cooking our supper, and then heading down on a glorious morning where the rain that day didn't arrive till mid-afternoon, and it was just one of those magical mornings. The previous night there'd been a full moon rising over the giant heather forest. We got up to this glorious dawn. The helichrysums were beaded in dew, and then the sun came and they burnt the everlasting flowers. They burst into life. Well, tramping through this extraordinary forest, I read about it when I got back, the account by Filippo de Filippi, who wrote the official account of the expedition back in 1906. And describing this forest, he wrote about forest trunks and boughs are entirely smothered in a thick layer of mosses, which hang like waving beards from every spray cushion, and englobe every knot curl, and swell around each twig, deform every outline, and obliterate every feature, till the trees are a mere mass of grotesque contortions, monstrous tumefactions of the discoloured leprous growth. No forest can be grimmer and stranger than this. Well, I thought on a glorious sunny morning it was just magical, and not to mention all the wonderful flowers underfoot, and it was one of my great days in the mountains, rushing down through this forest, having successfully completed the third of our African peaks. Well, we got back to the roadhead, and you have to remember this is over 30 years ago. I don't think digital cameras had even been thought of at that stage. They certainly didn't exist. But Willoughby very cleverly and imaginatively had brought with him a Polaroid camera. And at the end of each section of this trip, he presented each of the porters with a photo of themselves and handed to them in a little leather wallet, because back in Hong Kong he sold wallets to people, commemorative wallets, which was a really nice touch as a token of appreciation for the people who do all the hard work which enables us to enjoy our little games in the mountains. It was wonderful to get back to a hotel, to have a hot shower, and on our final day before returning home, we were treated to a leisurely cruise on Lake Edward at the foot of the Ruwenzori to enjoy some of the magnificent lowland wildlife before heading for home, which brings me to the end of my talk.
Fantastic, Stephen. Thank you so much for that. And you've certainly inspired me to try and complete my list of African peaks. Fascinating. Thank you very much. There are a number of questions that have popped up. So the first one is, you've climbed the highest peaks in the world. How does climbing an 8,000 meter peak compared to climbing something like Kilimanjaro at just below 6,000 meters?
Much the same, really. It's all about acclimatization. I'm a very slow acclimatizer, and so we went up to nearly 6,000 meters on Kili in a week from London, and I can't really do that. If I'd had my way, we would have started on something else first and then progressed to Kili. So I was really struggling. When I went back in '89, I took a drug called Diamox, which is quite well known, alleviator of high altitude symptoms, and did cope much better. But climbing in the Himalayas, normally you have a much slower approach, a longer time frame. And I mean, when I went to Everest, for instance, I was away for 4 months. I got to the summit 3 months after leaving London. So there was a very slow acclimatization process. Now, obviously, climbing at nearly 9,000 meters is much more serious and dangerous than at nearly 6,000 meters. But the human body can do it with enough time and enough acclimatization.
Fantastic. And on that subject, we've got a question here that tell us how, to someone that hasn't experienced it before, how does it feel to be climbing at altitude, and how does it affect different people? Now, I've noticed from my experience that it's very difficult to tell how altitudes are going to affect somebody.
Yes.
Because I've seen the fittest, youngest men really struggle with it, and to be polite, people who look less fit, not trouble them at all. So tell us a little bit more about how it affects the body and what process you go through for acclimatization.
Well, you're right, Jonathan. It's entirely random. I mean, on that African trip, I mentioned Victoria and Alexandra, the two sisters, who just seemed completely unfazed by altitude. I felt I was probably the weakest of the lot on the summit of Kilimanjaro. However, I was only the 20th person in the world to reach the summit of Everest without oxygen equipment. So clearly I can do it, but I just acclimatize very slowly. How does it affect you? Well, as when you get higher, typical effects are everything feels much harder work. You feel terrible sort of lassitude. You can get headaches. If those headaches become really persistent and serious, they can be the warnings of something more serious. And serious altitude sickness can be a killer, particularly cerebral edema, which is a build-up of fluid in the brain cavity, and that can be very dangerous. And it's something you do have to watch out for. Generally, mild altitude sickness does just take the form of feeling. I mean, people have often described it as feeling as though you're suffering from a bit of a hangover. You just feel, you've got a headache, you feel very weak, you feel off colour, everything just feels very hard work. At its most extreme form, just doing up your bootlaces feels like an almost impossibly difficult task. So it's a matter of degree. And generally it's a matter of trying to take things slowly, and the critical thing is not pushing yourself too hard, and ironically, extreme altitude sickness takes the form of a build-up of fluid in the lungs or the brain, but the greatest enemy of altitude is dehydration. And often, actually, what we call a high altitude sickness is just plain old-fashioned dehydration, because you're working very hard, often in quite dry air, and just not getting in enough liquid, and that can give you a headache at sea level. So that's the biggest problem.
Yeah, fantastic. I described it once as to somebody and saying to them that it's the only time in my life that my only goal was to reach a rock about a meter away from me, and to make the steps I had to make to that rock. And once I reached that rock, I found another rock about another meter and a half away to reach that one. And that was how I felt when I was climbing at the top of Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, me too. I can really identify with that.
Fantastic. So another question: some of the huts we saw on the and tents we saw on the on your slides look very small and very intimate, shall we say? So the question is: have you got any funny stories relating to living in such close proximities with other mountaineers? And a supplementary question to that: who is your favourite tent mate in your time?
Favorite tent mates? Well, I don't think I'm anyone's favorite tent mate. I snore badly. So I think if people have to share a tent with me, they've drawn the short straw. Proximity to other people, yes, it's tough. I think on Mount Kenya there was someone called Louisa Verney, and she had just arrived. Hadn't been up Kilimanjaro. She and her another friend from London was completely unacclimatized, and the first night on Mount Kenya, already quite high, she drew the short straw and had to share a tent with me and put up with my snoring. So it can be tricky, life at altitude. I think my most memorable sojourn in fairly close quarters was on the Antarctic island of South Georgia, where on one occasion South Georgia gets a lot of bad weather, a lot of bad storms sweeping across the Southern Ocean, and we had a lot of problems with our tents being destroyed. So we dug a big snow cave in the side of a glacier at about 2,000 feet above sea level, about 600 meters, which is quite high on South Georgia. And we lived in the snow cave for a total of 23 days. We actually had two wings, a south wing and a north wing. We had a fitted kitchen, but occasionally it got a bit warm, just above freezing. It would drip, so we actually pitched tents inside the snow cave. Anyway, we lived there on and off for 23 days in total, and it was very cozy, but a bit gloomy, because the daylight is sort of filtered through the snow, so that you're living in this rather sort of cold blue light, and you do occasionally long for the bright open spaces.
Fantastic. I've got a fairly topical question, actually, as I know the world has been sort of focused on climate change and such like in the last few weeks. It says from Adam, it says, you mentioned the vanishing diamond couloir.
Yes.
How do modern images and records of summits and your records of summits differ from the ones you saw when you climbed? Climate change is clearly evident in a lot of cases, yes. Or are things much the same?
The mountains are the ultimate litmus test, and I mentioned South Georgia and in Antarctica. I've seen colossal changes there just in 30 years. I have not been back to the Ruwenzori Mountains, but Henry Osmaston, who I mentioned, who died a few years ago, right up to his death, he was collecting photos, doing the new edition of his guidebook, monitoring what was happening in the Ruwenzori Mountains. And the photos I've got of when we climbed Margarita in early 1987, if you compare those with photos who've been there recently, you would barely recognize them. And the picture I showed that my friend Julian Freeman Atwood took of the, in fact I could probably go back to it, Julian Freeman Atwood took of Alexandra and Margarita there. I don't know if that's appearing on the screen, but I think all those ice seracs and ice incrustations on the two summits. I think they've all gone now. I think the Elena Glacier is just a little shriveled remnant. So the equatorial mountains, like all the world's mountains, perhaps more than many other mountains around the world, are visible indicators of very rapid recent climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that insight. I don't think we have any more questions, so it leaves me to really sum things up, really. So as many of you know, one of Nacio Trust's big fundraisers that we do every year is climbing Kilimanjaro, and if you'd like to climb Kilimanjaro with us, I've just put a link in the chat, which sort of gives you a link to our website, which is very simply Climb Kilimanjaro for Charity. And if you'd love to join us on a climb, travel to East Africa has now reopened again. I'm here myself at the moment in Kenya, traveling back to the UK on Sunday, but so we are open again for business, as it were. So and I know the guides, the porters and everything who climbing something like Kilimanjaro is their staple diet for their way of living, as it were, are desperate to welcome people back to the mountain again. So if you'd like to join us, please do check out our website. I've just put that in the chat. And finally, it leaves me to say, Stephen, thank you so much for your insight. You've certainly whetted my appetite for climbing some of the less known mountains, like Mountains of the Moon and such like, and actually getting to the top of the climbing peak of Mount Kenya as well. That would certainly be one that's on my list that I'd love to go and finish off. And you've certainly inspired many, I imagine, as well. So I'd just like to say a great big thank you for everybody at Nasio Trust for doing a talk for us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Great stuff. Okay, cheers then. Bye.
Bye.